I'm reading from Ordinary Men again, but this part is difficult. It is the Nazis encountering their first experience shooting Jewish people without any forewarning. This is to show the human experience and to help people who have family members who are a part of ICE or who are in the military and are pro-Trump or still MAGA. This is a reminder that they do hit a limit. It's usually too far, but there is a limit. And hopefully we can keep us from getting there again. So, if you are not in a space to hear the stories of these men, it's okay. This video is not going to be for everyone, and I do not want anyone to feel pressured to watch it. And to preface again also that the Holocaust did happen. The Jewish people of Europe did not deserve what happened to them. And Jewish people are not ruling the world. So if you came here to praise Hitler, GTFO, you dumb motherfucker. In contrast to First Company, the men of Second Company received no instruction on how to carry out the shooting. Initially, bayonets were not fixed as an aiming guide, and as Hergert noted, there was a, quote, considerable number of missed shots, end quote, that, quote, led to the unnecessary wounding of the victims, end quote. One of the policemen in Hergert's unit likewise noted the difficulty the men had in aiming properly. Quote, at first we shot freehand. When one aimed too high, the entire skull exploded. As a consequence, brains and bones flew everywhere. Thus we were instructed to place the bayonet point on the neck, end quote. According to Hergert, however, using fixed bayonets as an aiming guide was no solution. Quote, through the point-blank shot that was thus required, the bullet struck the head of the victim at such a trajectory that often the entire skull, or at least the entire rear skull cap, was torn off, and blood, bone splinters, and brains sprayed everywhere and besmirched the shooters, end quote. Hergert was emphatic that no one in First Platoon was given the option of withdrawing beforehand. But once the executions began, and men approached either him or Scheer because they could not shoot women and children, they were given other duties. This was confirmed by one of his men. During the execution, word spread that anyone who could not take it any longer could report. He went on to note, quote, I myself took part in some 10 shootings, in which I had to shoot men and women. I simply could not shoot at people anymore, which became apparent to my sergeant, Hergert, because at the end I repeatedly shot past. For this reason he relieved me. Other comrades were also relieved sooner or later, because they simply could no longer continue, end quote. Lieutenant Drilker's 2nd Platoon and the bulk of Sergeant Steinmetz's 3rd Platoon were assigned to yet another part of the forest. Like Scheer's men, they were divided into small groups of 5 to 8, each rather than large groups of 35 to 40 as in Wachlow's first company. The men were told to place the end of their carbines on the cervical vertebrae at the base of the neck. But here, too, the shooting was done initially without fixed bayonets as a guide. The results were horrifying. If you ever wondered why soldiers have PTSD, it's because humans killing humans is traumatic. No matter how tough you think you are. The results were horrifying. Quote, the shooters were gruesomely besmirched with blood, brains, and bone splinters. It hung on their clothing. End quote. Elliot is so upset with this that he's actually throwing up now. So, if you needed another sign that ew. Okay. When dividing his men into small groups of shooters, Drucker had kept about a third of them in reserve. Ultimately, everyone was to shoot, but the idea was to allow frequent relief and, quote, cigarette breaks, end quote. Baby, leave them be. Thank you. Thank you. With the constant coming and going from the trucks, the wild terrain, and the frequent rotation, the men did not remain in fixed groups. The confusion created the opportunity for work slowdown and evasion. Some men who hurried at their task shot far more Jews than others who delayed as much as they could. After 2 rounds, one policeman simply slipped off and stayed among the trucks on the edge of the forest. Another managed to avoid taking his turn with the shooters altogether. Quote, it was in no way the case that those who did not want to or could not carry out the shooting of human beings with their own hands could not keep themselves out of this task. No strict control was being carried out here. I therefore remained by the arriving trucks and kept myself busy at the arrival point. In any case, I gave my activity such an appearance. It could not be avoided that one or another of my comrades noticed that I was not going to the executions to fire away at the victims. Notice how he calls them victims. They showered me with remarks such as shithead and weakling to express their disgust, but I suffered no consequences for my actions. I must mention here that I was not the only one who kept myself out of participating in the executions. End quote. By far the largest number of shooters at Josfau who were interrogated after the war came from the 3rd Platoon of 2nd Company. It is from them that we can perhaps get the best impression of the effects of the executions on the men and the dropout rate among them during the course of the action. Hans Dettelmann, a 40-year-old barber, was assigned by Drucker to a firing squad. Quote, it was still not possible for me to shoot the first victim at the first execution, and I wandered off and asked Lieutenant Drucker to be relieved, end quote. Dettelmann told his lieutenant that he had a very weak nature, and Drucker let him go. Walter Nahaus, a former Reemtsma cigarette sales representative, was paired with an elderly woman for the first round. Quote, after I had shot the elderly woman, I went to Tony Benthium, his sergeant, and told him that I was not able to carry out further executions. I did not have to participate in the shooting anymore. My nerves were totally finished from this one shooting. End quote. For his first victim, August Zorn was given a very old man. Zorn recalled that his elderly victim, quote, could not or would not keep up with his countrymen because he repeatedly fell and then simply lay there. I regularly had to lift him up and drag him forward. Thus, I only reached the execution site when my comrades had already shot their Jews. at the sight of his countryman who had been shot, my Jew threw himself on the ground and remained lying there. I then cocked my carbine and shot him through the back of the head. Because I was already very upset from the cruel treatment of the Jews during the clearing of the town and was completely in turmoil, I shot too high. The entire back of the skull of my Jew was torn off and the brain exposed. Parts of the skull flew into Sergeant Steinmetz's face. This was grounds for me, after returning to the truck, to go to the first sergeant and ask for my release. I had become so sick that I simply couldn't anymore. I was then relieved by the first sergeant. George Kagler, a 37-year-old tailor, made it through the first round before encountering difficulty. Quote, after I had carried out the first shooting, and at the unloading point was allotted a mother with daughter as victims for the next shooting. I began a conversation with them and learned that they were Germans from Kassel, and I took the decision not to participate further in the executions. The entire business was now so repugnant to me that I returned to my platoon leader and told him that I was still sick and asked for my release. End quote. Kagler was sent to guard the marketplace. Neither his pre-execution conversation with his victim nor his discovery that there were German Jews in Josval was unique. Shkmi, the man who had first stepped out, encountered a Jew from Hamburg in the marketplace, as did a second policeman. Yet, another policeman remembered that the first Jew he shot was a decorated World War I veteran from Bremen, who begged in vain for mercy. Franz Kassenbaum, who during his official interrogation had denied remembering anything about the killing of Jews in Poland, suddenly appeared uninvited at the office of the Hamburg State Prosecutor investigating Reserve Police Battalion 101. He told how he had been a member of a firing squad of 7 or 8 men that had taken its victims into the woods and shot them in the neck at point-blank range. This procedure had been repeated until the 4th victim. Quote, the shooting of the men was so repugnant to me that I missed the 4th man. It was simply no longer possible for me to aim accurately. I suddenly felt nauseous and ran away from the shooting site. I had expressed myself incorrectly just now. It was not that I could no longer aim accurately, rather that the 4th time I intentionally missed. I then ran into the woods, vomited, and sat down against a tree. To make sure that no one was nearby, I called loudly into the woods because I wanted to be alone. Today, I can say that my nerves were totally finished. I think that I remained alone in the woods for some 2 to 3 hours. Most of those who found the shooting impossible to bear quit very early, but not always. The men in one squad had already shot 10 to 20 Jews each when they finally asked to be relieved. As one of them explained, quote, I especially asked to be relieved because the man next to me shot so impossibly. Apparently he always aimed his gun too high, producing terrible wounds in his victims. In many cases, the entire backs of victims' heads were torn off, so that the brains sprayed all over. I simply couldn't watch it any longer. End quote. At the unloading point, Sergeant Bentheim watched men emerge from the woods, covered with blood and brains, morale shaken and nerves finished. Those who asked to be relieved, he advised to slink away to the marketplace. As a result, the number of policemen gathered on the marketplace grew constantly. As with First Company, alcohol was made available to the policemen under Drunker and Steinmetz, who stayed in the forest and continued shooting. As darkness approached at the end of a long summer day and the murderous task was still not finished, the shooting became even less organized and more hectic. The forest was so full of dead bodies that it was difficult to find places. Sorry, this is hard to read. Find places to make the Jews lie down. When darkness finally fell about 9 p.m., some 17 hours after Reserve Police Battalion 101 had first arrived on the outskirts of Josfau, and the last Jews had been killed, the men returned to the marketplace and prepared to depart for Bilgeraj. No plans had been made for the burial of the bodies, and the dead Jews were simply left lying in the woods. Neither clothing nor valuables had been officially collected, though at least some of the policemen had enriched themselves with watches, jewelry, and money from their victims. The pile of luggage the Jews had been forced to leave at the marketplace was simply burned. Before the policemen climbed into their trucks and left Josfau, a 10-year-old girl appeared, bleeding from the head. She was brought to Trapp, who took her in his arms and said, quote, "You shall remain alive," end quote. One policeman remembered vividly, quote, how individual Jews fell on their knees before Trapp and tried to kiss his hands and feet. Trapp, however, did not permit this and turned away, end quote. The policeman returned to Bilgeraj with no explanation for the strange turn of events. Then, on July 20th, precisely 1 month after its departure from Hamburg, and 1 week after the Josfau massacre, Reserve Police Battalion 101 left Bilgeraj for redeployment in the northern sector of the Lublin district. There is only a single group alive on Earth who deserves that treatment. Not a single one.